The end came not with a bang, but with the whisper of a northern wind through skeletal trees. It was a sound Alara had come to know as the voice of her own solitude, the rustle of dead leaves her only companion as she fled the life that had unmade her. For 6 days, she had run. She had run until the ache in her lungs was a fire and the burn in her muscles a constant scream. She ran from the memory of the Alpha's final judgment, his words colder than the first frost clinging to the forest floor. Unfit. Unworthy. Broken. The words were a litany, a brand on her soul more permanent than any of the scars that marred her skin. Her pack, the Silver Moon, had prized perfection. Their wolves were sleek, their pelts unblemished, their movements a symphony of predatory grace. Alara had been born an Omega, the lowest of the low, a life of deference and submission etched into her bones from her first breath. But she had tried. Gods, how she had tried. She had thrown her body in the path of a rogue bear to protect the Alpha's heir, earning a jagged tear from shoulder to elbow. She had fought territorial skirmishes with a ferocity that belied her station, collecting a tapestry of nicks and cuts across her back and legs. Each scar was a testament to a loyalty they refused to see, each mark a cry of devotion they chose to ignore. They saw only the damage. A flawed vessel. The final rejection had been for a scar she hadn't earned in battle. A punishment, delivered by the Alpha's own claws, for failing to anticipate a rival pack's raid. 3 parallel gashes that ran from her left temple, across her cheek, and down her neck, a permanent mark of her failure. It was the flaw that broke the pack's tolerance. She was exiled that very night, cast out with nothing but the tattered tunic on her back and the atlas of her pain written across her body. Now, the forest was thinning, giving way to barren, rock-strewn highlands that clawed at a bruised twilight sky. This was the border. The edge of the known world, beyond which lay the Shadowlands, the domain of the Vampire King. A place of myth and terror, a kingdom of eternal night from which no wolf who entered ever returned. Her pack had used the stories as threats to keep pups in line. Behave, or King Kaelin will snatch you from your bed and drink you dry. But exhaustion was a more potent fear than any childhood monster. Her body was failing. The hunger was a hollow, echoing thing in her gut. The cold had seeped into her marrow. She stumbled over an unseen root, her body hitting the frozen earth with a force that jarred every bone. She didn't have the strength to rise. This is it, then. The thought was distant, detached. She stared at the pale, thin moon hanging in the sky, a sliver of bone against black velvet. It looked indifferent. She thought of the pack, warm in their dens, their bellies full, their pelts pristine. A single, hot tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek, a stark contrast to the numbing cold. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the encroaching darkness, the scent of pine and frozen stone filling her senses. She did not feel the ground vibrate with the silent approach of footsteps. She did not see the 2 figures that materialized from the shadows, their forms impossibly still, their eyes glowing with a faint, predatory light. They stood over her, their expressions unreadable, cloaked in the ancient stillness of their kind. One of them knelt, a pale, elegant hand reaching out not to touch her, but to hover just above the angry, fresh scars on her face. A low murmur, a language like the shifting of gravestones, passed between them. Then, darkness claimed her fully. When consciousness returned, it was in fragments. The feeling of being lifted, weightless. The scent of dust and cold stone, of something ancient and floral, like roses left for centuries in a crypt. A murmur of voices, hushed and sharp. Then, a throne room. The image burned into her mind, stark and overwhelming. It was a cavern of polished obsidian, the ceiling lost in shadow, the only light coming from glowing crystals that pulsed with a cold, white luminescence. The air was frigid, still, and heavy with the weight of ages. She was on her knees, held firm but not unkindly by the 2 guards. Before her, on a throne carved from a single piece of black stone that seemed to drink the light, sat the Vampire King. He was nothing like the monster from the stories. There were no fangs bared, no monstrous features. He was unnervingly beautiful, a creature of stark contrasts. Hair as black as a starless night fell around a face of pale, sculpted marble. His eyes, however, held the terror of the legends. They were not red, but the color of twilight, a deep, fathomless violet that seemed to hold all the sorrow and cruelty of 1,000 years. He was utterly still, his long-fingered hands resting on the arms of his throne. He did not look at her face, not at first. His gaze was fixed on her arms, on the sliver of scarred skin visible where her tunic was torn at the shoulder. "An intruder, Your Majesty," one of the guards said, his voice a low, respectful rumble. "A lichen. Found unconscious on the northern border." The king did not respond. The silence in the hall deepened, becoming a physical pressure. Ilara's heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs, a wild, living drum in a hall of the dead. She could feel the stares of other vampires lining the walls, shadows within shadows, their collective curiosity a palpable force. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the sentence. Waiting for the end. "Look at me," the king commanded. His voice was not loud, but it filled the vast space, a low, resonant baritone that vibrated in her bones. It was the voice of absolute authority. Slowly, trembling, Ilara forced her head up. She met his gaze, her terror a raw, open thing. He finally looked at her face, his violet eyes tracing the 3 fresh lines of her exile. She flinched, expecting the disgust, the revulsion she knew so well. It was the scar that had broken her, the final, unforgivable flaw. The king leaned forward slightly, a subtle shift that drew every eye in the room. His expression was not of disgust. It was one of intense, consuming fascination. A flicker of something unreadable, not pity, not cruelty, but something else entirely moved in the depths of his ancient eyes. The silence stretched, taut and thin. "Take her to the West Wing," he said at last, his voice soft, yet carrying the finality of a chisel striking stone. "Have the royal physician attend to her." A collective, silent gasp seemed to move through the assembled court. The guard holding her arm stiffened in surprise. "Your Majesty, the law is clear." "The law is what I say it is," Kalen interrupted, his tone dropping into a register of glacial cold that promised swift and terrible consequences for any further argument. He rose from his throne, a fluid, silent movement. He descended the 2 steps and stopped before her. He was taller than she'd realized, a monolith of shadow and power. He knelt, an act so unexpected it stole the breath from her lungs. He was now at her level, his twilight eyes just inches from hers. He reached out, and for a terrifying second, she thought he would touch the scars on her face. Her entire body went rigid. But his fingers stopped, a breath away from her skin. "All this damage," he murmured, his voice for her alone, a sound like crushed velvet and winter nights. They saw it as ruin. He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in every mark, every line, every broken piece of her. "I see a map. And I wish to learn the roads." The world swam in a haze of fear and confusion. Ilara found herself in a bed softer than any she had ever known, the sheets cool silk against her fevered skin. The room was vast and opulent, hung with dark tapestries depicting star charts and constellations. A fire crackled in a massive stone hearth, its warmth a welcome stranger against the pervasive chill of the castle. A small, bird-like vampire with gentle hands and eyes the color of faded parchment had tended to her wounds. He had cleaned and stitched the deeper cuts with a detached, clinical efficiency, his touch light and impersonal. He had offered her water and a thin, savory broth that warmed her from the inside out, the first real nourishment she'd had in days. But her terror remained, a cold knot in her stomach that no fire could touch. She was a prisoner. A curiosity. A wolf in a den of ancient spiders. She lay rigid, listening to the unnatural silence of the castle. There were no sounds of life as she knew them, no wind in the trees, no chirping insects, no distant howl. Only the crackle of the fire and the frantic, rabbit-quick beat of her own heart. She kept her arms covered, her hands tucked beneath the heavy duvet, her body curled inward as if to protect itself from the very air she breathed. The physician had clucked his tongue over the sheer number of scars, the old, silvery lines and the new, angry welts. He had called them a tragedy of a life, and the words, though perhaps meant kindly, had felt like another brand. The heavy oak door opened with a barely audible click. Ilara's head snapped towards the sound, her body tensing so hard it ached. It was him. The king. Kaelan entered the room as if he were part of the shadows, moving with a liquid grace that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. He wore no crown, no regal trappings, only simple black trousers and a dark grey tunic that made his pale skin seem almost luminous in the firelight. He dismissed the physician with a subtle inclination of his head, and the smaller vampire scurried out, closing the door softly behind him. They were alone. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She pushed herself up, her back pressing against the carved headboard, trying to make herself smaller, to retreat into the very wood of the bed. Kaelan didn't approach immediately. He stood by the fire, one hand resting on the mantel, his profile stark and perfect against the flames. For a long moment, he simply watched her, his violet eyes holding that same unnerving, analytical curiosity she'd seen in the throne room. "You are afraid," he stated, not as a question, but as a simple observation, like noting the color of the sky. "You have no reason to be. No one will harm you here." His reassurance did nothing to soothe her. Harm came in many forms. The pack had rarely harmed her with outright malice. It was their judgment, their disgust, their constant, weary disappointment that had flayed her soul. "Why am I here?" she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. "Because I wished it," he answered simply, as if that were the only explanation the universe required. He turned from the fire and walked towards the bed. Each silent, deliberate step was a lifetime. He stopped at the foot of the bed, a respectful distance away. "The physician tells me your wounds are not life-threatening. But they are extensive. You have been fighting for a very long time." Ilara said nothing, just watched him, her knuckles white where she gripped the duvet. His gaze fell to her left arm, to the puckered, jagged scar left by the bear claw, a ridge of damaged flesh she usually kept hidden at all costs. "May I?" he asked, his voice low and soft. It was a genuine question, a request for permission that she had never, in her entire life, been granted. She didn't know how to respond. A nod felt like too much, a shake of her head felt like defiance she couldn't afford. So she remained frozen, her silence a wall. He seemed to understand. He didn't move closer. "That one is old," he said, his eyes fixed on the scar. "The edges are smooth, the tissue has settled. A clean, violent tear. The claw of a large predator, I would guess. A bear, perhaps. Fought in defense, not aggression. You were protecting something. Or someone." Ilara stared at him, her heart thudding. He read the mark on her skin like a scholar reading a line of ancient text. He saw not the ugliness of the wound, but the story behind it. The accuracy of his assessment was chilling. How did you know?" she breathed. A faint, ghost of a smile touched his lips, a fleeting expression of melancholy. "I have lived for a very long time, Ilara. I have seen the marks war leaves on kingdoms, on stone, on people. The principles are the same. Every scar tells a story of the force that made it, and the resilience of the thing that survived it." He finally lifted his gaze from her arm to her face. "Your skin is a chronicle. A history of courage and pain. They called it ruin. I call it scripture." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and strange. Scripture. A holy text. He looked at the marks that had caused her so much shame and saw something sacred. The concept was so foreign, so utterly alien to everything she had ever been taught, that her fear was momentarily eclipsed by a profound, dizzying confusion. He was a monster, a creature of nightmare. But the look in his eyes held more reverence than she had ever received from her own kind. He saw her, the entirety of her, the damaged surfaces and the history they represented, and he did not turn away. For the first time, someone was looking at her scars and not seeing failure. He was seeing a map. And he, the Dark King of this forgotten kingdom, was the only one who had ever offered to learn its language. The thought was more terrifying than any threat of violence. It was a whisper of a hope she had long ago learned was too dangerous to harbor. Weeks bled into one another, measured not by the rising and setting of a sun that never seemed to penetrate the perpetual twilight of the Shadowlands, but by the slow, quiet rhythm of the castle. Ilara became a phantom in its halls, a whisper of movement in the endless corridors of black stone and faded tapestry. She was given a wardrobe of simple, dark dresses, all with long sleeves and high necks, and for that she was grateful. She could remain hidden, her chronicle of pain kept under wraps, a secret between her and the silk. She spent her days in the blessed anonymity of the castle's colossal library, a place so vast it seemed to contain all the silence in the world. The scent of old paper and leather was a balm to her frayed nerves. She would find a secluded alcove, a book of forgotten histories open but unread in her lap, and simply exist, a ghost among the ghosts of words. She rarely saw the king, yet she felt his presence everywhere. It was in the way the castle guards would nod at her with a new, grudging respect. It was in the fresh meals that would appear outside her door, left by silent servants who vanished before she could see their faces. It was in the fire that was always lit in her hearth before the deepest chill of night set in. He was an invisible guardian, an architect of a strange, unnerving comfort. She knew he was watching. Sometimes, from the corner of her eye, she would see a shadow detach itself from a far-off archway, a glimpse of a tall, dark figure observing her from a distance before melting back into the gloom. He never approached, never spoke. He simply watched, his patience as boundless and ancient as the stone around them. From Kaelin's perspective, she was a fascinating study in survival. He had ruled for 2 millennia, surrounded by the static perfection of his kind. Vampires did not scar, they did not age, they did not break in the same fundamental way mortals did. Their sorrows were emotional, eternal, and abstract, the weariness of ages, the loss of sun and life. But Ilara was a living testament to physical struggle. She was a creature forged in violence and rejection, and yet she moved with a quiet, persistent grace. He saw the way she flinched from sudden movements, the way she always positioned herself with her back to a wall, the way she held her arms crossed over her chest, a physical barrier against a world that had only ever brought her pain. He felt a strange, protective ache in his long-dormant heart. He saw her hiding her scars beneath layers of cloth and felt a profound sorrow, not for the scars themselves, but for the shame she carried with them. The pack that had cast her out were fools. They had discarded a diamond because they were too blind to see past the rough stone encasing it. They had looked at a masterpiece of resilience and seen only a spoiled canvas. He found himself thinking of her constantly, her scent a wild, clean mix of forest and winter air, a faint, lingering trace in his ancient senses. He wanted to know the story of every mark. He wanted to trace the jagged line on her shoulder and understand the terror and bravery of that moment. He wanted to understand the pain that had carved the lines on her face. He wanted to unmake the shame they had taught her. One evening, as the glowing crystals in the library cast long, distorted shadows, he decided the time for silent observation was over. He had given her space, allowed her to acclimate to the unnatural stillness of his world. Now, he needed to bridge the chasm between them. He moved through the labyrinthine shelves, his footsteps making no sound on the cold stone floor. He found her in her usual spot, a small alcove overlooking a sheer drop, the chasm outside filled with a swirling, permanent mist. A book of ancient poetry lay open on her knees, but her gaze was distant, lost in the grey emptiness beyond the window. She was so wrapped in her solitude she didn't sense his approach until he was standing just a few feet away. She gasped, her whole body jerking in alarm, her hand flying to her chest as if to calm her frantic heart. The book slid from her lap and landed on the floor with a soft thud. "Your Majesty," she stammered, scrambling to her feet, her head bowed in submission. "There is no need for that," he said, his voice gentle. He bent and retrieved the book, the movement fluid and effortless. He held it out to her. "I did not mean to startle you." Her hand trembled as she took it, her fingers brushing against his for a fraction of a second. His skin was cool, smooth as polished marble. The brief contact was like a spark of lightning, and she snatched her hand back as if burned. He saw the fear in her eyes, the ingrained instinct to recoil from touch. "I am sorry," she whispered, looking at the floor. "You have nothing to be sorry for," he said. He gestured to the window seat. Please, after a moment's hesitation, she sat, perching on the very edge of the cushion, ready to flee. He did not sit beside her, but leaned against the opposing bookshelf, creating a space of non-threatening distance between them. He nodded toward her right forearm, which was partially visible as she clutched the book. A thin, white line, almost perfectly straight, ran from her wrist halfway to her elbow. It was different from the others, less violent, more deliberate. That one, he said softly, his voice an invitation, not a demand. It is precise. Not a claw, not a tooth. A blade, I think. But the angle is wrong for an opponent's strike. It is a scar of self-infliction, or perhaps, a ritual. Ilara's breath hitched. She instinctively tried to cover the mark, pulling her sleeve down. The scar was from her coming-of-age ceremony, a blood oath of loyalty to the pack, an oath they had so easily discarded. The memory was sharp, painful. The sting of the ceremonial knife, the pride she had felt, the hope that this vow would finally make her worthy. All of it now tasted like ash. She looked up at him, her throat tight. He wasn't looking at her with judgment. His violet eyes were filled with a quiet, solemn understanding. They wrote their laws on your skin, he murmured, his voice resonating with a deep, ancient sadness. They made you carry the evidence of their bonds, and then punished you for the marks of your survival. In my kingdom, history is written in books, he gestured to the towering shelves around them. Vellum and ink, easily stored, easily forgotten. You were made to be your own chronicle, with no pages to turn, no cover to close. You must carry it all, always. He pushed off from the bookshelf and took a single step closer. He knelt before her, just as he had in the throne room, bringing himself to her level. The act of submission from a being of such immense power was deeply disorienting. I do not wish to cause you pain, he said, his voice barely a whisper. But I wish to understand. Will you allow me? He held out his hand, palm up. An offering. A choice. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to protect the fragile, broken thing that was her soul from this ancient, predatory creature who saw too much. But his eyes held no threat. They held only a profound, patient curiosity and a strange, aching tenderness. For the first time in her life, someone was asking for permission to see her, not just to look. Slowly, hesitantly, as if moving through deep water, she uncurled her fingers from the book and placed her trembling hand in his. His cool fingers gently closed around hers, his touch a strange comfort in the echoing silence of the library. The touch was a cataclysm. A quiet, world-altering event that sent a tremor through Ilara's very foundations. His skin was not cold in the way of death, but cool like river stones, a stark contrast to the nervous heat of her own. His fingers were long and elegant, and they held her hand with a gentleness that was utterly foreign. It was not the rough grip of a packmate, the punishing grasp of an alpha, or the clinical prodding of a healer. It was a touch that asked for nothing, that simply held. A silent acknowledgement. He brought her hand closer, his violet gaze dropping to the thin, white line on her forearm. With his other hand, he reached out, his forefinger tracing the scar with an impossibly light pressure. It wasn't a touch, it was the ghost of one, the barest whisper of contact. A shiver traced its way up her spine, but it was not of fear. It was something else, something she couldn't name. A vow, Kaelan murmured, his eyes never leaving the mark. Made in earnest. Broken by another, he looked up, meeting her wide, startled eyes. To pledge your life in blood and be met with betrayal, that is a deeper wound than any blade can make. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, hot and sharp. He saw the truth of it, the story beneath the story. He didn't ask what she had done to deserve it, or why the vow had been broken. He simply acknowledged the pain of the betrayal itself. No one had ever done that. To her pack, the breaking of the vow was her failure. To the King of Shadows, it was their cruelty. She pulled her hand back, the contact suddenly too intense, too intimate. She cradled her arm to her chest, the skin where he had touched her tingling with a strange warmth. Kaelan let her go without resistance, his hand falling back to his side. He remained kneeling before her, his patience a tangible thing. I am sorry, she whispered again, for the second time that night. I'm not used to. She trailed off, unable to articulate the whirlwind of her feelings. I'm not used to being seen. I'm not used to gentleness. You do not need to be, he said, his voice soft. We have an eternity for you to grow accustomed. He rose to his feet in that same fluid, silent motion. The library is yours. The castle is yours. You are not a prisoner here, Ilara. You are a guest. He gave a slight, formal bow of his head. I will leave you to your reading." And then he was gone, melting back into the shadows of the stacks as if he had never been there at all. Ilara sank back against the cushions, her body trembling. Her heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She looked down at her arm, at the pale scar that had been a source of such shame. He had touched it. He had touched her brokenness and called it a vow. He had looked at her history and named it betrayal, placing the blame not on her, but on those who had hurt her. The thought was revolutionary. It was terrifying. It was a single candle lit in the vast, dark cavern of her loneliness. The encounter in the library shifted something in the castle's delicate social ecosystem. The king's interest was no longer a secret, speculative thing. He had sought her out. He had shown her favor. And in a court that had remained static for centuries, any change was a seismic event. The whispers grew louder, slithering through the cold halls like drafts of wind. The other vampires, who had previously regarded her with a detached, clinical curiosity, now watched her with a mixture of suspicion, envy, and contempt. She was a stray. A mongrel. A lesser being, mortal and scarred, who had somehow captured the attention of their immortal, perfect king. The epicenter of this resentment was Valerus. He was one of the king's oldest courtiers, a vampire of immense power and influence, with a face as cruel and beautiful as a shard of ice. He saw Ilara as an aberration, an impurity in their pristine world. He believed Kaelin's fascination was a sign of weakness, a morbid sentimentality that threatened the cold, hard strength upon which their kingdom was built. He made his displeasure known not through direct confrontation with his king, he was not that foolish, but through 1,000 subtle cruelties directed at Ilara. His followers would turn their backs when she entered a room. They would fall silent, their conversations dying on their lips, their cold eyes following her every move. They made her feel like a stain on their perfect, ageless tapestry. Kaelin was not blind to this. He saw the shift, heard the whispers, felt the court's disapproval like a change in barometric pressure. He knew he had to make a statement, to solidify her position and grant her the protection of his public authority. And so, he commanded a formal dinner. The entire court would be in attendance. And Ilara would sit at his right hand. When the invitation was delivered to her room on a heavy cream card, her name written in an elegant, flowing script, panic seized her. A formal dinner meant being on display. It meant facing them all, the hundreds of ancient, predatory eyes, their judgment of physical weight. It meant wearing one of the formal gowns that had been provided for her, gowns that, while beautiful, felt like a costume for a part she didn't know how to play. She wanted to refuse, to lock herself in her room and hide. But she knew she could not. It was a command from the king. The night of the dinner, she stood before the mirror in her chambers, her reflection a stranger. The dress was the color of a deep twilight sky, a dark, shimmering blue that matched Kaelin's eyes. It was modest by the court's standards, but the cut of the neckline revealed the very top of the 3 scars of her exile. She had tried to hide them with her hair, but it was impossible. They were there, a declaration of her flawed, broken history for all to see. Her hands were trembling so badly she could barely clasp the simple silver chain Kaelin had sent as a gift. A soft knock came at her door. When she opened it, Kaelin himself stood there. He was dressed in formal black, a silver brocade waistcoat his only concession to opulence. He looked regal, powerful, and impossibly ancient. His eyes swept over her, and for a moment, his perfect, stoic mask slipped. A flicker of raw appreciation, of something warm and deeply personal, shone in their violet depths. "You look exquisite," he said, his voice a low murmur. He saw her hand instinctively go to the scars on her neck. His expression softened. "Courage, Ilara," he whispered. "Tonight, you are not a stray they deign to tolerate. You are my guest. And they will show you the respect that title commands." He offered her his arm. After a beat of hesitation, she took it, her small, scarred hand resting on the fine black wool of his sleeve. His presence was a solid, reassuring anchor in the storm of her anxiety. Walking into the grand dining hall on the king's arm was like walking into a silent explosion. The hall was a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, all vaulted ceilings and impossibly tall stained glass windows depicting scenes from the kingdom's long, bloody history. A single, massive table stretched the length of the room, lit by thousands of candles that floated in the air, their light glinting off silver, crystal, and the cold, watchful eyes of the assembled court. As one, they all rose, their movements silent and synchronized. The conversations ceased. The only sound was the faint, ghostly music of a string quartet in a high gallery and the soft tap of Alara's shoes on the marble floor. The collective weight of their stares was a physical blow. She could feel their disdain, their shock, their resentment. She wanted to shrink, to disappear. But Kaelin's hand came to rest over hers on his arm, his touch a silent message: "I am here. You are safe." He led her to the head of the table and seated her at his right before taking his own seat. The court Saturday. The meal began, served by silent, gliding servants. The food was exquisite, the wine fragrant and rich. But Alara could not taste a thing. Her throat was tight with tension. The silence at the table was thick with unspoken hostility. Finally, Valerus, seated a short distance down the table, broke it. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice smooth as poisoned honey, "the court is intrigued by your newfound charity." He gestured vaguely in Alara's direction with a pale, elegant hand. "To bring a stray lichen into our halls is one thing. To seat her at your right hand, it is an unprecedented honor. One wonders what she has done to deserve it." The challenge was laid bare. The air grew thick and cold. Every eye was on Kaelin. Alara froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. She could feel a blush of shame and fear creep up her neck. Kaelin took a slow, deliberate sip of his wine, his gaze never leaving Valerus. He placed the goblet down with a soft click that echoed in the silence. "She has survived," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the hall. "She has endured suffering that would shatter beings 1,000 times her age. She has fought for a people who discarded her. She bears the chronicle of her life on her very skin, a testament to a strength you, Valerus, in your comfortable, unchanging immortality, cannot possibly comprehend." He turned his gaze from Valerus and let it sweep across the entire table, pinning each courtier in place. "Her scars are not marks of shame. They are medals of honor, earned in a war none of you have ever had to fight. She is not an it, she is Alara. And she is my guest." His voice dropped, losing its quiet reason and taking on the glacial edge of command. "She will be afforded every courtesy and respect due to that station. Any who fail in this will answer directly to me. Is that understood?" The authority in his voice was absolute, a tidal wave of power that swept away all opposition. Valerus paled, his smug expression crumbling. He inclined his head, his eyes fixed on the table. "Perfectly, Your Majesty." A murmur of assent went around the table. The challenge had been met and utterly crushed. Kaelin had not just defended her, he had elevated her. He had taken her greatest shame, the very source of her exile, and declared it a thing of honor in front of his entire court. He had drawn a line in the stone of his castle, placing her firmly on his side of it. Alara looked at him, at his proud, beautiful, terrible face, and felt a surge of something fierce and unfamiliar. It was not just gratitude. It was a dizzying, terrifying wave of belonging. In this kingdom of eternal night, under the protection of its dark king, she was, for the first time, not broken. She was honored. The king's declaration hung in the air of the castle for days, a shield and a statement. The overt hostility from the court vanished, replaced by a grudging, fearful compliance. They bowed their heads when she passed. They made space for her in the halls. But their eyes were still cold, their acceptance a thin veneer over a core of resentment. Alara knew she was safe, but she did not feel at ease. The protection was his, not hers. She was still a borrowed thing, living on borrowed time in a borrowed world. The shame, though publicly refuted by the king, still lived inside her, a coiled serpent in her gut. It was a creature of habit, and it fed on darkness. It came for her in the deep of night, in the unnerving silence between one heartbeat and the next. Sleep had always been a treacherous country for her, a landscape of shadowed memories. But in the oppressive quiet of the vampire castle, the nightmares had a new and terrible clarity. Tonight, she was back in the Alpha's den. The air was thick with the scent of wet fur, blood, and ozone. The entire pack was there, their yellow eyes glowing in the gloom, a circle of silent judges. The Alpha stood over her, his massive form blotting out the light from the den's entrance. His voice was a low growl that vibrated in her chest. A flaw in the bloodline. A weakness we can no longer afford. He raised his paw, the claws extended, glinting like shards of obsidian. She remembered the feeling, the searing, tearing pain as they raked across her face. It was not just the physical agony, but the spiritual severing. With that single motion, he was not just marking her, he was unmaking her, erasing her from the pack, from her family, from the only life she had ever known. The pain was absolute, a fire that consumed everything. Ilara awoke with a scream caught in her throat, a strangled, guttural sound of pure terror. She was thrashing in the silken sheets, her hands flying to her face, half expecting to feel fresh blood. The room was dark, the fire in the hearth burned down to glowing embers. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Tears streamed down her face, hot and fast. The phantom pain on her cheek was so real, so vivid, she could barely breathe. She curled into a tight ball, her body racked with silent, shuddering sobs. The serpent of shame was uncoiled, its venom flooding her system. Broken. Unworthy. Flawed. The door to her chamber opened without a sound. In the faint, dying light of the embers, a tall figure filled the frame. Kaelan. He must have heard her. He moved into the room, his presence a sudden, solid anchor in the swirling chaos of her panic. She flinched, trying to stifle her sobs, ashamed of this weakness, this raw, uncontrolled display of her brokenness. He didn't speak. He didn't turn on a light or ask what was wrong. He simply crossed the room and sat on the edge of her bed. The mattress dipped with his weight, a subtle, grounding pressure. He did not touch her. He just sat there, a silent, unmoving sentinel in the dark. His stillness was a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. It was a rock in a churning sea. Minutes passed. Her sobs slowly subsided into ragged, hiccuping breaths. The phantom pain on her face began to fade, leaving behind the dull ache of memory. The silence in the room was no longer empty or oppressive. It was filled with his patient, unwavering presence. It was a silence that held space for her grief without demanding an explanation for it. It was a memory, she finally whispered into the darkness, her voice hoarse. She didn't know why she spoke. Perhaps it was the quiet safety he offered, the feeling that she could say anything and he would simply accept it. "I know," he replied, his voice a low rumble, devoid of pity. It was a simple statement of fact. She took a shaky breath. "The last one. The scar they gave me when..." She couldn't finish the sentence. "When they sent you away," he finished for her, his tone flat, factual. He understood. Of course, he understood. He had read the story on her face from the first moment. He still didn't touch her, but he shifted slightly, turning more fully towards her. "The wounds of the mind are deeper than any blade," he said softly. "They do not scar over. They remain open, and they bleed in the dark." His words were a perfect articulation of her own experience. He was a creature of the night, a being who lived in shadows. He understood the things that festered in the absence of light. He was not afraid of her darkness. He simply sat with her in it. For the first time, she felt as if someone else could see the invisible wounds, the ones that hurt far more than the visible marks. She didn't know how long they sat there in the near darkness, the embers slowly turning to grey ash. He never moved, never spoke again. He was just there. A solid, unshakable presence that kept the nightmares at bay. As the first hint of the perpetual twilight of his kingdom began to filter through the high windows, her exhaustion finally overtook the lingering terror. Her breathing evened out. Her body, still curled in on itself, began to relax. She drifted into a true, dreamless sleep, the first she had known in years. And through it all, the King of Shadows kept his silent vigil, a dark guardian against the ghosts of her past, his presence a promise that she was no longer alone in the dark. The night of the nightmare marked a subtle but profound turning point. The serpent of shame had not been slain, but Kaelan's silent vigil had robbed it of some of its venom. The simple act of him sitting with her in her terror, not offering empty platitudes or demanding explanations, but simply sharing the darkness, had forged a new kind of intimacy between them. It was a bond built not on words, but on shared silence and quiet understanding. Ilara found herself breathing a little easier in the vast, cold castle. The halls seemed less menacing, the shadows less hungry. She began to test the boundaries of her own courage in small, almost imperceptible ways. One morning, she left the door to her chambers unlocked. It was a small act, but for someone who had lived her life in a state of constant defensiveness, it felt monumental. It was an act of trust. That afternoon, instead of hiding in the most secluded corner of the library, she chose a reading chair in the main chamber, in view of the few other quiet patrons. No one bothered her, but the simple act of being visible, of choosing not to hide, sent a quiet thrill of defiance through her. A few days later, she did something even bolder. The morning was, like all mornings, a wash of grey light. She stood before her wardrobe, looking at the rows of dark, high-necked dresses. On a whim, she reached for a simple tunic of dark green velvet, one with sleeves that ended just below the elbow. When she put it on, the jagged, ugly scar from the bear attack was visible, a pale, puckered roadmap of violence on her forearm. So was the thin, white line of her broken vow. She looked at her reflection, her heart thumping. For a moment, she was tempted to change, to cover herself back up. But then she thought of Kaelin's words. A chronicle. Medals of honor. She took a deep breath and walked out of her room. She felt naked, exposed. Every glance from a passing guard or servant felt like a judgment. She kept her arms pressed tight to her sides, but she didn't run back to her room. She made her way to the small, enclosed garden on the eastern battlement, a place she had discovered that was often deserted. The air there was cold and crisp, and strange, pale flowers bloomed in the perpetual twilight, their petals unfurling for a sun they would never see. She was not alone for long. She heard no footsteps, but a subtle shift in the air announced his presence. Kaelin stood in the archway, his eyes on her exposed arms. She instinctively tensed, her first instinct to hide them. But she forced herself to remain still, to meet his gaze. He didn't smile, but the cool neutrality of his expression softened, and a warmth entered his violet eyes. He saw her act of courage for what it was. He walked toward her, holding something in his hand. It wasn't a jewel or a trinket of the court. It was a small, exquisitely carved wooden wolf, its head thrown back in a silent howl. The craftsmanship was remarkable, every detail perfect, from the fur on its ruff to the pads of its paws. "I am not much of a craftsman," he said, his voice a low murmur as he stopped before her. "My hands are better suited to holding a sword or a pen." But I found myself compelled. He held it out to her. A wolf is not meant to be a solitary creature. Her breath caught. It was the most personal, most thoughtful gift she had ever received. It was an acknowledgement of what she had lost, of the pack nature that was so intrinsic to her being. It was also a recognition of her strength. The wolf was not cowering or broken, it was proud, its voice lifted to the sky. She took it from him, her scarred fingers brushing against his. This time, she didn't pull away. The wood was smooth and cool beneath her touch. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She looked from the small carving in her hand up to his face. "No one has ever." She trailed off, unable to find the words. "I know," he said softly, and the simple phrase was filled with a world of understanding. His gaze dropped to the bare scar on her arm. He didn't ask to touch it this time. He simply looked at it, his expression thoughtful. "The pain of this one has faded. But the courage it took to earn it has not." They stood in silence for a moment, the quiet broken only by the faint, rustling whisper of the pale flowers. It was a comfortable silence now, not a tense one. A quiet joy, fragile and new, unfurled in Ilara's chest. It was a feeling she had not experienced in so long she had forgotten its name. It was the feeling of being seen, not just for her wounds, but for the strength it took to carry them. "There is something I would like to show you," Kaelin said, his voice drawing her from her thoughts. "If you are willing." She nodded, clutching the small wooden wolf in her hand. He led her from the garden, through a series of corridors she had never explored, to a heavy iron door at the base of the highest tower. He produced an old, ornate key and unlocked it. The door swung open onto a spiral staircase that wound its way up into darkness. My private conservatory, he explained, gesturing for her to precede him. Few have ever been inside. She hesitated for only a second before stepping onto the first stone step. She was choosing to trust him, to follow him into the dark. As they ascended, glowing crystals set into the walls pulsed to life at their approach, illuminating the way. They climbed for what felt like an eternity, the air growing warmer, more humid, tinged with the scent of damp earth and blooming things. At the top, another door opened into a space that stole her breath. It was a massive glass dome at the very pinnacle of the castle, a transparent bubble against the bruised twilight sky. And inside was a jungle. A riot of impossible life. Plants with leaves of silver and black, vines that dripped starlight, and flowers of such a deep, luminous blue they seemed to have swallowed the evening sky. At the center of it all was a single, magnificent flower, its petals the color of blood, slowly unfurling in the dim light. The heart-blood bloom, Kaelin said from behind her. It blossoms only one night a year. I have watched it bloom alone for 500 years. He came to stand beside her, his shoulder almost brushing hers. I find I no longer wish to. Ilara stared at the impossible, beautiful flower, its scandalous color a shock in this world of monochrome and shadow. She looked at the king who had guarded it in solitude for half a millennium. He had shared his solitude with her. He had given her a key, a place, a moment that was his alone. And in that gift, she felt the first, true, terrifying stirrings of hope. Not just for survival, but for something more. Something like home. The shared moment in the conservatory lingered between them, a silent, binding thread. The castle began to feel less like a gilded cage and more like a sanctuary. Ilara found herself seeking out Kaelin's company, their conversations in the library or their quiet moments in the twilight gardens becoming the anchor points of her days. He spoke of history, of art, of the slow, creeping weariness of immortality. He spoke of the world as it was centuries ago, his words painting vivid pictures in her mind. But he never spoke of himself, not really. His past was a locked room, a country to which she had no map. One evening, as the ever-present mist swirled outside the windows of the western parapet, they stood together, watching the slow dance of the grey clouds. The air was cold, and Ilara had her arms wrapped around herself, though not to hide. It was a simple gesture against the chill. "You are cold," Kaelin observed. He didn't move to offer his cloak, an act she knew would be too forward, too much like a claim. Instead, he gestured to a small, sheltered alcove nearby, where a brazier of coals glowed with a dull, red heat. "Come." They sat on the stone bench, the warmth of the brazier a small comfort against the vast, cold emptiness of the sky. The silence stretched, but it was a comfortable, familiar thing now. Ilara found herself tracing the jagged scar on her forearm with her own finger, a gesture that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. Kaelin noticed the movement. "You no longer hide them," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You taught me not to," she replied, her voice soft. You see them differently." "I see the truth of them," he corrected gently. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze lost in the glowing embers. When he spoke again, his voice was different, laced with a vulnerability she had never heard before. "We are not so different, you and I. My scars are simply less visible." Ilara looked at him, surprised. He seemed perfect, untouchable, a being carved from marble and shadow, beyond the reach of the kind of damage she knew. "I don't understand." A sad, faint smile touched his lips. "I was not always a king," he began, his voice distant. "I was not always." This he gestured vaguely at himself, at his own immortal stillness. "I was a soldier, once. A mortal man. I had a brother. His name was Lucian." The name was spoken like a prayer, or a curse. "We fought in a war for a king whose name is now dust. We fought side by side. He was the light to my shadow, the laughter to my silence." His violet eyes grew dark with memory. "On the battlefield, I was wounded. A poisoned arrow. I was dying. Lucian, in his desperation, sought out a creature of the night, one of the first of my kind, and begged her to save me. She agreed, but the price was high. She demanded a life for a life. Not my brother's, but my own. My mortal life, he paused, the silence heavy with the weight of unspoken grief. She turned me. I awoke to a world of ash and shadow, my heart silent in my chest, a terrible thirst on my tongue. I was saved. But I was damned. He looked at Ilara, and in his eyes, she saw a pain so ancient and so deep it made her own sorrows feel small and new. That is my first scar, Ilara. The one no one can see. The day I lost the sun. The day I lost my brother. He could not bear to look at what I had become. The monster his love had created. I never saw him again. The confession hung between them, raw and bleeding. He had given her a piece of his own brokenness, a shard of his soul. He had shown her a wound that would never heal, a loss that echoed through centuries. It was an act of profound trust, a bridging of the immense gulf between them. He was not just a king, not just a vampire. He was Kaelan. A man who had lost his brother, who had lost the sun. Tears welled in her eyes, not for herself, but for him. For the mortal man he had been, and the lonely king he had become. Without thinking, she reached out and laid her hand on his arm. Her touch was hesitant, but it was not afraid. It was a gesture of comfort, of shared sorrow. He looked down at her hand, at her scarred fingers resting on the fine black wool of his sleeve. He did not flinch or pull away. He simply covered her hand with his own, his cool skin a strange comfort. A small, watery laugh escaped her lips, a sound of surprise. "It's foolish," she whispered. "What is?" he asked, his voice still thick with memory. She looked down at her other arm, at a small, crescent-shaped scar near her wrist. This one she felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to share, to offer a piece of herself in return. "It's not from a battle. Or a punishment," she took a breath. "When I was a pup, I was convinced I could fly. The elders told stories of the sky spirits, and I wanted to be one. I climbed the tallest pine tree at the edge of the territory, right on the cliffside. I made wings out of leaves and branches." She shook her head, a real smile touching her lips for the first time. "I jumped." Kaelan's expression shifted, his ancient sorrow momentarily replaced by rapt attention. "I didn't fly," she continued. "I fell. I landed in a thicket of thorn bushes. My father was so angry, but my mother laughed until she cried as she pulled the thorns out of my hide. This," she pointed to the small scar, "was the last one she pulled free." The memory was sweet, a small, perfect moment from a life she had thought was nothing but pain. Sharing it felt good. It felt like reclaiming a part of herself that the pack had tried to erase. A low, soft sound came from Kaelan's chest. It took Ilara a moment to recognize it. He was laughing. It was not a loud or boisterous sound. It was a quiet, rusty chuckle, like a machine that hadn't been used in centuries. But it was genuine. The sound was miraculous, a flower blooming in the cracks of a tomb. It transformed his face, chasing away the shadows of 1,000 years, revealing a glimpse of the man he had once been. "You tried to fly," he said, a note of wonder in his voice. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a light she had never seen before. "Of course, you did." In the shared warmth of the brazier, surrounded by the cold twilight of his kingdom, they sat together, hand in hand. A werewolf covered in the scars of a life of struggle, and a vampire king bearing the invisible wounds of eternity. One who had been cast out for her imperfections, and one who had been trapped in his. And for the first time, in the quiet exchange of their stories, their scars, they were not just a king and his ward. They were Kaelan and Ilara. And they were not alone. The fragile peace of their shared world was shattered by the arrival of a scout. He was found at the southern border, deep within vampire territory, his leg caught in a snare laid for poachers. He was a wolf from the Silver Moon pack. Ilara's pack. He was brought to the castle, not as a guest, but as a prisoner, and his presence sent a jolt of ice-cold fear through her. The past she had been so carefully trying to outrun had finally caught up to her. Kaelan summoned her to the throne room. It was empty save for the two of them and the captive wolf, who knelt between two stoic guards. He was young, a wolf she recognized named Finn. His eyes were wide with terror, his gaze darting around the obsidian hall as if he expected the walls themselves to attack him. When he saw Ilara, his expression shifted to one of disbelief, and then a strange, desperate hope. "Ilara," he breathed. "By the moon, it's you. We thought you were dead. What do you want?" Ilara asked, her voice cold, betraying none of the turmoil in her heart. She stood near the throne where Kaelin sat, positioning herself slightly behind him, seeking the shelter of his power. "I have been sent by Alpha Marcus," Finn said, his voice gaining a bit of strength. He asks for your return." The words were a physical blow. Return. The thought was suffocating. Return to the scorn, the judgment, the constant, grinding weight of their disapproval. Return to being the pack's living symbol of failure. "Why?" Kaelin's voice cut through the air, sharp and cold as ice. He had not moved, but his presence seemed to fill the room, his power a palpable pressure. Finn flinched, his gaze snapping to the king. He swallowed hard. "Since she was cast out, the hunts have been poor. Sickness has taken 2 of the new pups. The elders say her exile has unbalanced the pack's spirit. That it has brought ill fortune. Alpha Marcus believes her return will set things right." Ilara felt a bitter, hysterical laugh bubble in her throat. Superstition. They didn't want her back out of remorse or love. They didn't miss her. They missed their scapegoat, their good luck charm in reverse. They had thrown her away like a broken tool, and now that their crops were failing, they wanted the tool back, believing its mere presence would fix their fortunes. The arrogance, the selfishness of it, was breathtaking. "He is willing to overlook her flaws," Finn continued, stumbling over the word as he glanced at the scars on her face. "She will be welcomed back. Her station will be restored." "Her station," Kaelin repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "You mean her station as a thing to be beaten, reviled, and discarded at will? What a generous offer." Finn paled, realizing his mistake. "No, Your Majesty, I only meant—" "I know what you meant," Kaelin said, rising from his throne. He descended the steps and paced slowly before the kneeling wolf, his movements a silent, predatory dance. "You come into my kingdom, uninvited. You speak of spirits and fortune to me, a being who has forgotten more magic than your pack has ever known. And you demand the return of a guest under my protection, as if she were a piece of property you have misplaced." He stopped in front of Finn, looking down at him with utter contempt. "Your Alpha is a fool. And you are a poor messenger." The terror in Finn's eyes was absolute. He was a young wolf, facing down a being of myth and legend, a king whose wrath could unmake him with a thought. Kaelin turned his back on the scout and looked at Ilara. His face was a mask of cold fury, but his eyes, when they met hers, held a question. He had made his position clear to the court, but this was different. This was her past, her pack. He was giving her the choice. He would not command her to stay. He would not force her to go. The decision had to be hers. All her life, choices had been made for her. Her station, her duties, her exile. She had been a passive recipient of the whims of others. But here, in this hall of shadows, the most powerful being she had ever met was waiting for her word. He was offering her an agency she had never known. Fear was a cold, familiar hand gripping her heart. The thought of returning was a nightmare. But the thought of refusing, of severing that final tie to the only world she had ever known, was also terrifying. What was she without her pack? A lone wolf, an anomaly, a creature with no place. But then she looked at Kaelin. She saw the silent promise in his eyes, the unwavering strength in his posture. She thought of the library, the conservatory, the quiet sharing of scars. She thought of the small wooden wolf she kept by her bedside. She had a place here. A strange, new, terrifying place. But it was a place she was choosing. She took a deep breath, the air cold and sharp in her lungs. She stepped forward, out from behind the shelter of the throne, and stood on her own. She looked down at the wolf from her pack, at the boy who represented everything she had fled. "I am not a lucky charm, Finn," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I am not a tool to be used and discarded. And I am not a scapegoat for your Alpha's failings." She lifted her chin, meeting the scout's frightened gaze. "You can tell Alpha Marcus that my station was never his to restore." She turned to Kaelin, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked him in the eye, her fear and her hope a raw, open prayer. "Don't let them take me," she whispered, the words a fragile, desperate plea. It was the first thing she had ever truly asked of him. "Please." A profound stillness settled over Kaylin. Her words, her choice, resonated in the ancient, silent chambers of his heart. "Don't let them take me." It was not a plea for rescue. It was a declaration of allegiance. She had chosen him. She had chosen this life, this kingdom of shadows, over the world of sun and grass that was her birthright. She had asked for his protection not as a victim, but as an ally. The trust in that simple request was more precious than any treasure he had amassed in 2,000 years. He turned his gaze back to the terrified scout kneeling on the floor. The cold fury in his expression had been replaced by something far more terrifying: absolute, final judgment. "You have your answer," Kaylin said, his voice resonating with the power that held the very stones of the castle together. "Ilara is under the protection of the Crown of Shadows. She is a member of my household. An attack on her is an attack on me. An insult to her is an insult to this kingdom." He took a step closer to Finn, who flinched as if struck. "Go back to your Alpha. Tell him that what he has cast away, I have claimed. Tell him that her worth is not something to be debated by superstitious curs. It is a fact, as immutable as the stone of these mountains. Tell him to count himself fortunate that I am feeling merciful. If any of you ever cross my borders again with her name on your lips, I will wipe the memory of the Silver Moon Pack from this world so completely that not even the dust will remember you." The threat was delivered without a single raised decibel, yet it carried the weight of an avalanche. It was not a boast, it was a promise. Finn scrambled to his feet, bowing low, his body trembling uncontrollably. "Yes, Your Majesty. I understand, Your Majesty." "Guards," Kaylin commanded without looking away from the wolf. "Escort him to the border. See that he is not harmed. His message must be delivered." The two vampire guards materialized at Finn's side, their hands gripping his arms. They half lifted, half dragged the terrified wolf from the throne room, his footsteps echoing in the sudden, vast silence. And then they were alone. Just Kaylin and Ilara, standing in the center of the immense, empty hall. The weight of the moment, the finality of her choice, settled over her. She had cut the last thread. She was truly adrift. Kaylin turned to her. The regal fury was gone, the ancient power banked. He was simply Kaylin again, his violet eyes soft, filled with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. He saw the tremor in her hands, the fear and uncertainty warring with relief in her expression. He closed the distance between them, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not speak. He simply stood before her, a silent testament to the promise he had just made. She looked up at him, her throat tight. "Thank you," she whispered. It felt like such a small, inadequate word for what he had done. He had not just saved her. He had validated her. He had declared her worth to the world that had denied it. "There is nothing to thank me for, Ilara," he said, his voice a low, gentle murmur. "I did not give you your worth. I merely recognized what was already there." He reached out, not for her hand, but to gently cup her jaw, his cool thumb stroking the line of her cheek, just beside the angry, faded scars of her exile. The touch was reverent, tender. It was the touch she had flinched from on their first meeting, the touch she had feared her whole life. And now, it felt like a benediction. She leaned into his hand, a small, unconscious movement of trust and acceptance. "They are fading," he murmured, his thumb tracing the uppermost scar. "The anger is gone from them. They don't hurt anymore," she replied, her voice barely audible. And she realized, with a jolt of surprise, that it was true. The phantom pains, the constant, low-level ache of memory, had vanished. They were just marks on her skin now, lines in a story whose ending was finally being rewritten. He held her gaze, and in the depths of his ancient eyes, she saw it all. His loneliness, his sorrow, his centuries of solitude, and the new, fragile light she had brought into his world. And in that moment, she understood that he had not just been protecting her. They had been protecting each other. She had saved him from his eternal, unchanging silence as much as he had saved her from her violent past. He lowered his head, his movement slow, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. She stood her ground, her heart a thunderous, hopeful drum. His lips met hers. The kiss was not one of passion or hunger. It was one of profound tenderness, of homecoming. It was the quiet click of a key turning in a lock, the gentle settling of a foundation after a long and violent storm. It was a promise of shared dawns, even in a kingdom that had no sun. When he drew back, he rested his forehead against hers. "You are home, Elara," he whispered against her lips, the words a vow. She closed her eyes, a single, perfect tear of joy tracing a path down her cheek, crossing the old, faded map of her pain. Home. The word settled into her soul, not as a concept, but as a truth. She was home. Here, in the arms of the vampire king, in the heart of the Shadowlands, this broken, rejected Omega, covered in the history of her pain, had finally found her home. The scars were not her ending. They were the map that had led her here. And their journey together was just beginning.